Hallo zusammen, wieder mal auf.
Hello everyone, back in German again. I'm Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, the one and only, Professor Ulrike Guérot. Ulrike, welcome.
Willkommen.
Good morning.
Freut mich sehr, dass wir das machen können, weil wir sprechen heute über ein...
I'm really glad we're able to do this, because today we're talking about a new book that's just coming out. Let me quickly show the cover here. It's this one, Germany Neutral, Security for Peace. And the subtitle says, To Be, or NATO Be. You'll have to explain to me who came up with that. It's definitely right up my alley. The idea that Germany should become a neutral state isn't new, of course. It actually goes back to the 1950s. But let's talk about that for a moment. I mean, the editors are Uli Gellermann, Arnulf Ratting, and Jens Fischer-Rodrian. So how are you involved in this project?
Rodrian, wie bist du in diesem Projekt integriert?
Yes, so once again, good morning, and thank you for letting me present the book here. You've shown it on screen, but of course I'm holding it in my hand because it's always a joy when a little baby book, so to speak, finally comes out of the publisher. The book was just released recently. These are big names, Gellermann and especially Ratting, both longtime veterans of the peace movement and of critical analysis in the Federal Republic of Germany. Jens Fischer-Rodrian is now a well-known singer-songwriter and musician who's been performing for years at peace festivals across Germany on topics like Ukraine and Gaza, together with his wife, Alexa Rodrian. So they're both very well known in Germany for their peace work. And the book brings together 33 authors, including me. So yes, I also contributed a piece to it. And basically, I think it's fair to say that these are, how should I put it, the remaining parts, in parentheses, of the old, genuine good left that still exists in the Federal Republic. The audience is quite mixed. There are older authors, younger ones, you could say that. But these are the writers who, over the past, let's say, 4 or 5 years, when the war in Ukraine began, came together around West End Verlag. And yes, we should point that out again. West End Verlag. West End Verlag is always, how should I say, a kind of badge of honor when you get criticized in the FAZ. Yeah, the West End Publishing House was recently criticized with almost a full page in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. They listed nearly every West End author by name. This one's there, and that one too. Basically, a shame list of people who say they don't want to live in hostility toward Russia. And supposedly it's so anti-American just to say that maybe the Americans have made a few mistakes, or that what's happening in Ukraine might be a proxy war, or that what happened in Iran actually started with the United States and not with the mullahs, as people here like to say. So all I'm saying is that's what West End Verlag is, a publisher that's come under fire precisely because it's still being reasonable. So this publisher has now brought together more than 30 authors in a situation, Pascal, I think that's the first thing we need to say, in a situation where Germany is every single day really intangibly preparing for war. And that makes me flinch every morning. I know your channel has international reach. I also travel to other countries. And my impression as a German living in Berlin is that when I'm in Barcelona or in Paris or in Zurich or even in Vienna, it doesn't feel as intense, not nearly as intense. What I mean by that is, it seems to me that the bias, the spin in the news, this kind of war rhetoric, this preparation for war, even shows up in these little phrases. This morning I was listening to the news on Deutschlandfunk, and then there was this little twist. They said the Bundeswehr is now being made fit again, ready for war with all that money. But unfortunately, our young men aren't really ready for war yet, or something like that. You know what I mean? Those little turns of phrase? Yeah. Or war, like they're a bit reluctant, they don't want to become soldiers. What I'm trying to say is this. at a time like this, when you almost get goosebumps, I actually got goosebumps this morning listening to the Deutschlandfunk news. At this very moment, West End Verlag is publishing this book. You have to understand that's kind of a pointed move. With this book, we're trying to spark a counter-discussion in this country. We'll talk about that in a moment, but actually, I think Germany is the core and anchor country of the European Union, or really of the whole European structure. I'd even say, unfortunately, because right now this country seems almost hypnotized to me. We have to go to war against Russia and so on, that kind of rhetoric. And at this point, it's important to say we need to turn that discussion around. That's why West End Verlag published this book, to give us a way to take it on stage, to bring it into small academies, to hold discussions, to have a solid text to work from. Yes, and these 33 authors approach the topic in very different ways, but you were just about to say something?
I just wanted to add something, maybe to share the seriousness of the situation. Also with the people who will listen to this conversation later in English, French, or Spanish, just to show how deeply the belief in war has already taken hold in Germany. You told me something before we started talking that really gave me chills about the Protestant Church. Could you briefly tell that story again, just so we can get a sense of how widespread the idea has become that a war is actually coming?
Yes. So I actually mentioned in the preliminary talk that Frida had already told me, for example, well, there are also a few Protestant pastors who are, of course, part of this book. Jürgen Fliege, for instance, is one of the authors. But within the Protestant Church, they've been completely marginalized. We've all basically been thrown out of the churches. I mean, I was kicked out of the university. So in Germany today, you're systematically pushed out of the system, so to speak, pushed out of the church, out of an office, or out of a professorship if you stand up for peace. I think you have to understand that in a non-German, or rather a non-European context. So what I'm doing right now, actually I can say this here, today on April 23rd, I'm filing a constitutional complaint. Because 3 years ago I was dismissed following the publication of a book called Endgame Europe. In that book, together with Hauke Ritz, we describe the background of the war in Ukraine since the Maidan. We include all the sources, also the American preparations for war, in effect a proxy war, pushing the Ukrainian-Russian border. So in a way, we show that nothing is ever as well prepared as an unprepared war of aggression. Anyway, as we've explained, this war wasn't some sudden, unexpected Russian war of aggression. The story is different. And about a week after the book came out, I was, so to speak, publicly sanctioned by the university through a press statement, and then later dismissed from the university. I'm mentioning this only because the topic here was the Protestant Church. Mr. Fliege, the author who also contributed to this book, is one of the pastors who's had serious trouble continuing to work within the Protestant Church while arguing for peace. I believe he's now retired or has emeritus status. That means we have to understand. I'm not exactly sure how it is in Italy, Spain, or other countries, but here in Germany, things are really being sanctioned now. There are quite a few of us who are being sanctioned. Jacques Bode, for example, ended up on an EU sanctions list. He's also one of the authors in this book. But back to the Protestant Church. There's a 26-page document. It was passed on to me by someone I know within the Protestant Church. I can share that document with you if you'd like. Maybe we can link to it. It's a PDF, so we'd have to upload it to a website first.
If we're allowed to publish it, then I can go ahead and do that. We'll take a look at it together. But for now, just give a quick description of that paper. What's in it?
Ja. Und dieses Papier fängt also erstmal mit einer, ich sag mal,
So,
kritiklosen Skizze
this
der
paper starts off with what I'd call an
Bedrohungssituation.
uncritical outline of the threat situation. The idea is NATO is under threat, Putin is rearming. Basically, the whole narrative told entirely from a Western point of view, without any critical counterbalance. I mean, is Ukraine really a liberal country? Is there political opposition in Ukraine? What's actually happened in this war? Busha and so on. I don't think I need to spell all that out here. The point is, it's a completely uncritical retelling of why democracy in Germany is supposedly under threat, and why the Protestant Church, therefore, has a special responsibility to promote ecumenical unity and help ensure that this country can defend itself securely.
Dass dieses Land sich sicher verteidigen kann. Ja? So, und dann wird das ausbuchstabiert. Was heißt das?
And then it gets spelled out in detail. What does that mean? It means, for example, that the Protestant Church is now thinking about, and apparently already in the process of, hiring more chaplains, because it's expected that there will be casualties from the war. Everything is being set up so that, for instance, the parents of fallen soldiers will need special support. That's why these chaplains who are already being selected will also need special training. And it also means that the churches, in their own spaces where discussions take place, have to make sure that the ecumenical unity holds together. That means there isn't someone sitting there asking, tell me, is this war really necessary? Could we tell this story differently? Do we maybe want peace? Do we maybe want understanding between nations like it says in our Constitution? Right? And I've just read that document. Well, to be honest, I couldn't even finish it. You start to feel sick when you read things like that, and you think, this can't be real, this is my country, so yes, things are really serious in Germany, and I can't say how it is in other countries. But in this situation, I just want to say again,
Yes, that's how serious the situation is. It's so serious that we have to realize even the Protestant churches in Germany are preparing for war. Not in some abstract way, not just through prayer, but through direct preparations for what needs to be done once we're actually at war. Because the war will come, and then we'll have to create unity, and we'll have to, as it's sometimes said in NATO, build a shared understanding of the enemy and readiness for war. And now, even the churches are getting ready for that.
well, not just that. It's almost like we're already talking about China. We're now moving into actual operational planning. I mean, we already have the operational plan in place, the so-called Operations Plan Germany. We know that Germany will be the hub in any military conflict. That's partly because we have Ramstein, the American military base. In both wars, Ukraine and Russia as well as Iran, all the data flows through there. So in that sense, there's already a debate about whether that's effectively a German involvement in the war, simply because we host the base. Formally, it's American territory, but it's still located in Germany. And of course, data is being sorted there for the American strikes in Iran, and at the same time for Russia and Ukraine. That means we're in an operational preparation phase. I can illustrate that with my hometown. My hometown is a small village on the Lower Rhine, Grevenbroich, and apparently a digital data hub is now being planned there. So, you always need these really large, how should I put it, huge computer systems that make sure the cables running from north to south are rerouted and stabilized. Because like any long line, those cables need reinforcement. A relay. Sorry, what was that?
Ein Relay.
Bitte?
A relay.
Ein Relay oder ein Hub oder wie auch immer, ja?
A relay, a hub, or whatever you want to call it. So now I see that in my city council, well, in our little town, it's being promoted with colorful flyers, a big investment project, great for the city of Grevenbroich because jobs, because this, that, and the other. And of course, you can see how an entire city, like so many German cities that are struggling a bit out of money, a bit run down, that's part of it too. how this city, meaning all the local officials, are now jumping on this project. Finally, there's something for the mayor, for the city council members, and so on.
Für den Bürgermeister, für die Stadtverordneten und so weiter. So. Und dann stellt man sich hin und sagt, sag mal, aber ihr wisst schon, dass
Then people stand up and say, wait a minute, you do realize that this is actually a weapon of war, right? And that, according to the UN Charter, military sites like production facilities and things like that are legitimate targets in a war. And then someone says, hold on, that would mean Grevenbroich, in effect, is like an arms factory and therefore a legitimate target. No, not at all. That's exactly the kind of delusion we need to recognize. Germany is already well on its way into the arms industry. Just look at the German auto industry, for example, which is now getting relief because of all these electric vehicles.
Zum Beispiel, die ja jetzt auch Entlastungen hat wegen dieser ganzen Elektroautos. Ne? Das haben ja alle mitbekommen, dass da die
Everyone noticed that the switch to electric cars didn't really work out that well. So what are Porsche, VW, BMW, and the others doing now? Well, they know how to build engines. And what kind of engines are needed right now? Tank engines. That means Porsche, VW, and the rest are now, of course, moving into the war economy, because that's where the money is. We've approved 800 billion, by the way, that was still done by the previous Bundestag, and with the votes of the left party. I have to say it clearly, with the votes of the left. Sarah Wagenknecht, the real left, is no longer in the Bundestag. The BSW has split off, and the left voted for it.
So, und die Linke hat das mitgestimmt, ja. So. Und in dieser Situation sitze ich also hier in diesem Berlin.
And here I am, sitting in Berlin, not even sure how to put into words what I'm feeling. I'm German, I know my history, and I could cry when I think about what happened in 1945, in 1949, and what we tried to do after that. Never again war, stop it before it begins, never again should war come from German soil. That was what I learned in school, what was in our textbooks. I'm 61 years old. That was the project of this republic. And now, for the past 10 years or so, or when did it really start? You can see how all of that is being swept away, as if someone just ran their arm across a table and knocked all the dishes to the floor.
Mit dem Arm über so einen Tisch gehen und einfach mal das Geschirr runterschmeißen, ja? Ich sehe eine Achse Macron.
I see an axis forming, and Macron senses it too, that has absolutely nothing to do with what I was once told was the Franco-German friendship. What I notice, and we just talked about this, is a completely uniform press. I'd be curious to know, maybe from people in Spain, Italy, the UK, Ireland, or Greece, whether things are, let's say, a bit better where you are. But here you turn on Deutschlandfunk and all you hear about is Ukraine. It's all about military aid, sure, fine. And now, Orban has been voted out, and the 90 billion from the EU have been approved.
Jetzt sind die 90 Milliarden von der EU bewilligt worden. Das heißt, die Freude ist jetzt groß, dass endlich auch die 90
That means people are really happy now that the 90 billion from the EU are finally coming. But it goes beyond that, and I'd like to point that out. In Germany, for example, the news yesterday reported that we're giving 1.4 million for building social housing in Ukraine. Meanwhile, we don't have enough social housing here ourselves. So we're kind of in a Ukraine fever. Really, a Ukraine fever. By the way, at most bus stops, you'll see posters from the German army. And interestingly, they usually show a woman, most often with a ponytail, a confident woman wearing headphones. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Ja, genau. Das ist dann, spricht dann so die souveräne Frau an.
That kind of message speaks to the self-assured woman, saying something like, you can be strong now, you can go into the fight, or something along those lines. I don't really know. You can probably hear in my voice that I'm almost gasping for air. Especially because, well, it's gotten so much more intense again in recent years. Since when, actually? Maybe since the Gulf War or so, it's really escalated again. Extremely, yes. And then we see things like, for example, the idea that the European-Israeli Association Agreement should be suspended. Who voted against that? Who vetoed it? Germany and Italy, the Axis powers of the last war. We're in a situation where...
Wir sind in einer Situation.
The question is, how do we get out of this?
How do we get out of this without ending up in a war with Russia?
Because when it comes to war, if people actually want to go to war, then you'll get one. Then people will be sitting in the train cars, smiling, waving flags, just like in the First World War, saying we'll be in Paris by Christmas. And now they'll be saying we'll be in Moscow by Christmas. Off they go, full of excitement. And that's when we end up at war. As long as people want to avoid war, as long as they're still afraid of it, we're on the safe side. But that, I think, is one of the biggest problems in Europe right now. Europeans aren't afraid of war anymore. In your book, you actually outline some alternatives, and I can't stress enough how important it is to imagine alternatives, even if they can't be implemented tomorrow. But tell me, how did it come about that this idea of a neutral Europe became the title of the book, Neutral Germany?
Neutrales Deutschland.
Das neutrales Europa wäre fast noch besser gewesen für
A neutral Europe might have been
aber
even better,
ist es
maybe,
erstmal für den
yeah?
deutschen Markt.
But, of course, this book is mainly for the German market for now. I'm not sure how the title came about. Germany neutral, that was really meant to pop the bubble a bit, so to speak. Because, you know, we now have this term kriegstüchtig in Germany. I'm not even sure if that word exists in other languages yet, but the idea was to really open up the range of options, as people say. And actually, there are different types of articles in it, 33 in total. Some of them are, let's say, short literary sketches.
Kleine literarische Skizzen. Es gibt auch sozusagen kleine Abhandlungen, warum Krieg einfach schlecht ist.
There are also, so to speak, short essays about why war is simply bad and why Germany should be neutral. There are artistic pieces, but of course there are also historical analyses, Wolfgang Effenkemper and others. So there are different, really quite different kinds of contributions. And some of them actually deal with German history and are, in a way, retellings of missed opportunities. In other words, the book tries to make the point, to put it in very simple terms, that here in Germany, we hoped we could build a stable, independent, and peaceful Europe together with the Americans, or through the transatlantic friendship.
Ein stabiles, unabhängiges, friedliches Europa bauen. Und uns fällt heute vor die Füße, dass
And now it's coming back to bite us that the Americans don't want exactly that. An independent Europe that gets along with Russia, that lives in peace. Think of Willy Brandt, Egon Bahr, Olof Palme, Bruno Kreisky. And this book tries to show why Germany is so crucial here. Because I believe that this whole transatlantic narrative, which is really a European narrative, plays a key role. Every European country, every EU member is always eager to be the best European friend. The Danes are the best friends of the US, the British, the Poles, the Dutch, the Germans. Every country believes it's the best friend.
Jedes Land glaubt für sich immer der beste Freund. Das haben die Amerikaner sehr geschickt eingefädelt. Ja? Im Moment
The Americans set that up very skillfully. Right now, it's the Poles who believe they're the best friends of the United States. Well, whatever. For a long time, they really were. Now, apparently, we have to make an effort again, because this is once more a very current issue. We're now stationing American missiles in Germany again, and there are practically no protests against it. Back in 1983, there were still huge demonstrations. Anyway, what this book is trying to do is tell Germans, wait a minute, are we really sure the Americans share the same interests we do? That they want the same things we want? That they have the same goals as we do when it comes to Russia? I mean, just the fact that we're here on this continent and the Americans are not, that alone makes a difference.
Geografisch auf diesem Kontinent sind und die Amerikaner eben nicht. Das heißt, Raketen fliegen nach Berlin und nicht nach Chicago.
That means rockets are flying toward Berlin, not toward Chicago. And what we're trying to do is tell that story, not just the idea that Germany should stay neutral so that ideally nothing happens right now, meaning peace talks, diplomacy, and so on. But the book also tells, let's say, the story of the Stalin Note of 52 and the various moments when there were real chances to shape an independent, sovereign Germany together with Russia within a European security framework. And opening up that story again, like reopening a kind of historical chest, goes directly against, and that's the key point, a narrative that's become deeply set in stone in our school books. Our school books basically tell one story. The Americans liberated us, there was chewing gum, then came the Marshall Plan, and without the Americans, nothing would have worked. Then the Franco-German relationship was added, and Kohl once wanted something a little different, but that's not considered important. And NATO protects us, now more than ever. So that's the continuous narrative, more or less. But by now, in Germany, we have people like Effenkemper and others, many authors who've actually gone into the archives. Jonas Togel, for example. By the way, all of them are authors with West End Verlag. I can say that here. They're all with West End Verlag.
Die sind alle beim West End Verlag. So, das heißt, wir wissen jetzt viel mehr über
That means we now know a lot more about the real turning points in history. We know a lot. Actually, we already knew much of it a few years ago, whenever those studies were written. But let's take the Élysée Treaty as an example. German-French relations, the idea of a German-French defense union, and so on. That treaty was basically stripped of its meaning overnight. Why? Because before it was ratified in the Bundestag, a preamble was added, a pro-NATO preamble inserted overnight. And the next day, when the treaty was signed, de Gaulle said at the press conference, let me try to get it right in French, treaties can die like deflowered young girls.
Verträge können sterben wie entjungferte junge Mädchen.
Was? Entschuldige, ich muss hier nur eine ganz kurze Einfügung machen. Was ist es mit den Franzosen und
Sorry, I just need to add one quick point. What's the deal with the French and all these comparisons about treaties? I think it was de Gaulle who said, state treaties are like roses and girls. They're good as long as they're good.
Sie sind gut, solange sie gut sind.
Exactly.
They're fading in the same, well, the French and their metaphors about girls. Okay, never mind.
Worauf ich nochmal hinaus wollte, ist, das Buch
What I wanted to get back to is this. The book portrays Stalin, de Gaulle, who of course wanted to keep equal distance between the US and the Soviet Union back then, the Eastern Treaties, Egon Bahr, Brandt, and so on. The book traces the different stages where politically significant forces in Germany and in Europe wanted to take a different path, meaning not a transatlantic one. And the book shows, of course, there's a lot more literature on this. These are just short articles, but our goal is to make it more widely accessible. What we're trying to show is that every time someone tried to take a different direction, it was always blocked.
Dass anders abgebogen wurde. Ja, also es gab eine massive Steuerung.
So there was massive control, basically American control, over German and European politics. They made sure, just like after the German-French Élysée Treaty of 1963, that it wouldn't turn into an independent German-French defense union. Instead, they insisted on putting a NATO preamble in front of it. And what we want with this book, well, what would be the purpose of such a book? If you even assume a book can serve a purpose and reach anyone beyond the 150 people sitting in a room?
Jemanden erreicht. Die Funktion von diesem Buch wäre,
the purpose of this book is to lift the glass dome we're sitting under. We're sitting under a massive dome, especially in Germany, but also across Europe. And underneath it, it just reeks. It reeks of a rotten, false narrative. And that stench is probably hypnotizing us right now, pushing us straight toward the next war. Germans leading the way, many Europeans following behind. Putin is Hitler, we have to march east again. The story urgently needs to be retold. And that's what this book is meant to contribute to.
Und dazu soll das Buch einen Beitrag leisten.
Da bin ich sehr froh dafür. Denn wie man diese Käseglocke
I'm really glad about that, because the question of how we can lift this glass dome, just so people underneath can finally get a breath of fresh air, that's actually a very good one. I really have the feeling that Europe is once again getting lost in this kind of solipsism, its own narrative, repeated over and over again ad nauseum, until it develops that stale smell and seeps into everything. And as an ordinary person, you have very few ways to access other interpretations of what's actually happening right now. That's why brainstorming efforts like the ones in this book are so extremely important.
Diese Brainstorming-Aktivitäten wie in diesem Buch eben so extrem wichtig. Und eben, also Deutschland hätte 52...
Well, Germany could have become neutral back in 52 or 53. Unfortunately, I have to say, the Soviets realized that too late. They had to wait for Stalin's death before they could have made Germany neutral. just as they could have done with Austria much earlier. When the Soviets, when Molotov, realized that if we set an example with Austria, let it become neutral and reunified, it might send a signal. But by then, the train had already left the station for Germany. Still, the idea itself, there's a very good scholar on this. I'm not sure if he writes about it in the book or not. Michael Geller, professor at the University of Heidelberg.
Professor an der Universität Heidelberg.
Yeah, you know him too.
Ein riesengroßes Buch, 1200 Seiten über.
He wrote this huge book, about 1,200 pages on the Stalin notes. And he, unlike other Austrian researchers, comes to the conclusion that no, the Stalin notes, this idea of a neutral, unified Germany, was actually meant seriously. In the end, it would have completed the entire cordon sanitaire the Soviets had envisioned, stretching from Finland through Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and down to Yugoslavia. That would have established exactly the position they wanted, and it would have made perfect sense. It wasn't a trick, it wasn't a preparation for an eventual attack. So Michael Geller is convinced, no, it really was meant seriously.
Michael Geller ist der Überzeugung, nein, das war schon ernst gemeint.
Grundsätzlich kann man ja sagen, dass
Well, basically, you can say that when the Russians present something, they usually mean it seriously. That's what surprises me in the current discussion. Back in 1986, I studied Soviet studies in Paris with Elenka Radonkos. So yes, I actually have a diploma in Soviet studies. And what did we learn back then? We learned that every text coming from the Russians has to be taken literally, word for word. Whether it's the 20th Party Congress or something else, whether a word appears in the first line or the third, it matters. Now we're watching all these videos. I assume you're watching some of them too. Karaganov, Dugin, and so on. What they're saying, what they're talking about. The point isn't to judge it right away, but first to really listen to what they're saying.
Yeah, that's not something people do in Europe. You're not even allowed to listen in the first place.
Exactly, nobody does that anymore. But if we actually did, we'd realize that all this time, just a few weeks ago, they were talking about a non-aggression pact, making those kinds of offers and so on, and nobody here is listening. So I personally believe the Stalin Note was meant seriously. I also think the Élysée Treaty was meant seriously by France before the Federal Republic basically undermined it again through the NATO preamble. Well, we also have people like Dirk Pohlmann with us. He's one of those truly critical journalists who've traced, so to speak, how the Americans intervened. So how did the Americans intervene in Austria, in Sweden with Olof Palme, and so on and so on? But what's really alarming is this whole question of how do we lift the lid off the cheese dome, so to speak? How do you lead a West German or European population out of this Stockholm syndrome? That's the real issue. I just mentioned earlier, we were told certain things for years, but this isn't just about some small book or a few pinpricks. This is about school books. It's about the curriculum in schools. It's about what's being taught. It's about the universities, about those publishers like UTB, the paperback series used in universities, and so on. They're all transatlantic, right? And that also means, and you've had other conversations about this on your channel, all our elites are transatlantic. There are three things you just can't talk about in Germany: capitalism, America, and Israel. Pretty much everything else, more or less, you can still talk about. But those three are absolute taboos. They're simply not up for discussion. And in times of war, like a US war or an Israel-Iran conflict, it's especially hard to break out of that framework when an entire system, the whole political and parliamentary system, has been raised and socialized in Atlanticism. Maybe just one more point. There's also this, I'm not sure if you can link to it, this censorship report, Germany. You probably know it from Libanet, the censorship report Germany, and that report exposes the network, meaning it shows which government funding actually goes to which NGOs, so that either pro-Ukrainian, pro-American, or whatever kind of propaganda ends up being spread. It's a huge network, of course, always presented as being under the protection of democracy or as protection against hate speech, and so on. In that report, this network quotes, if I remember right, on page 19, the social scientist Wolfgang Streeck from the Max Planck Institute. He says that Atlanticism has become a matter of state policy in Germany, and that anyone who doesn't fully go along with that canon, anyone who simply wants to have a discussion about it, like, is everything the Americans do with and for us really good? Do we have our own interests? Can we imagine an independent Europe? Can we imagine a Europe that reconciles with Russia? And so on? Well, those people get sanctioned. And that's exactly what happened to me. Because in that book, Endgame, the one I was fired over, I stepped outside that Atlanticist state doctrine. And that's where it ended for me, so to speak.
Ja, es ist einfach Guérot aus dem Ganzen raustritt, so wie Hüseyin Dogru aus diesem
From that whole stepping out, like Hüseyin Dogru stepping away from this Atlanticism. The others, the ones who are currently being sanctioned officially, or in other ways, maybe on a different level, by different forces, in the end, they're all driven by the same mindset, the same war mentality. Yeah, how to expose that, or how to...
Ja, wie man das lüftet oder auch...
Well, let's get to the point. What we're calling for, there are articles out there, for example, that clearly say this. There are several contributions in that book, and most of them basically say, finish NATO. Yes, NATO has to go. What's interesting is that we're talking here within a European bloc. The Spanish are saying it, the Irish are still officially neutral, even though in practice they're not really neutral anymore. We're talking about Germany now, but actually it's about the whole DACH region, Switzerland, Austria, and Germany. In Austria, that debate is also very strong. Now there are elections in Hungary, and there, people are talking about the Danube region, and I think with ideas that are quite different from what Ms. von der Leyen at the European Commission had in mind. I don't think Mr. Maygard is actually as pro-European or pro-Brussels as people made him out to be, just so they could celebrate that Orbán was voted out. I'm not saying the Hungarians are suddenly becoming neutral, but it's pretty clear they also want to keep ties with Russia and so on, and they're not following that strict war line the EU is on. We also have to distinguish between Europe and the European Union. As a German who's genuinely very worried about the state of our country, I really hope this book can connect with the debates happening in other nations. I think we now need a serious discussion across all EU countries, in Greece, Portugal, Spain, France, Sweden, and so on. What have the Americans actually done to us?
In Schweden, was haben die Amerikaner eigentlich mit uns gemacht? Und ich glaube, jedes Land muss diese Diskussion...
And I think every country has to have that discussion within itself to really reflect on why, for decades, a bit like those old Duracell ads in Germany, the little bunny that runs longer and faster, why every country somehow made it a principle to be America's best friend. If we look at France, that's actually quite interesting because de Gaulle broke away from that idea. He wanted equal distance. And for years, France was kind of the asterisk among Europeans. I mean, it only rejoined NATO under Sarkozy in 2008. For a long time, France stayed in the political structures but not the military ones, and so on. The French had a certain resilience against Americanization.
Eine gewisse Resilienz gegenüber der Amerikanisierung. Immer, übrigens auch im kulturellen Bereich. Sie haben auch immer...
Always, by the way, even in the cultural sphere, they've always upheld their own culture, their own cinema, not Hollywood. They've also long maintained their own scientific system in French for many years. But even in France, as I see it, and I'm there often, since my sons live in Paris, that scientific system has now become anglicized, basically switched over to English. Has the cultural side now also turned into iPhones and Starbucks even in Paris? And are the French now part of the military structures too? So something has shifted over the past 15 years. They resisted for a long time, but now things have changed.
Dagegen gehalten, aber jetzt hat sich was gedreht. Und jetzt kann man ja gucken, dass zum Beispiel das Rassemblement National.
Now, if you look at it, the National Rally, which is often seen as this big national party, is indeed very strong, around 40% in many regions. But the National Rally under Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, back in the 70s and 80s, was anti-capitalist, anti-American, and so on. In other words, it held positions that were actually typical of the traditional left. That's completely flipped today. The National Rally, meaning Bardella, Marine Le Pen's chosen protege, is now as pro-American as it gets, as pro-Zionist as it gets, as pro-Euro as it gets, and as pro-capitalist as it gets.
Pro-kapitalistisch as can be. Ja? Das heißt, man müsste ja fast vermuten, das tue ich.
That means you'd almost have to assume, and I actually make that point in my latest book, or rather in another one. You can also see it with the AfD, that the populist parties which originally set out to offer an alternative to this Atlantic narrative as political parties are basically all, let's say, being infiltrated in Austria, just like the AfD. And that's where the tug of war is happening now. About half of the AfD, remember in Germany we were once divided, we had East Germany and former East German citizens are actually all pro-Russian. Nobody here wants a war with Russia.
And by pro-Russian, I mean no war with Russia. Not that we want a war with Russia.
Yes, pro-Russian.
That's what we're seeing.
That's what we're seeing.
We really have to be careful not to fall into the same pattern as in those other cases.
Excuse me, but when I talk about diplomacy, about understanding, really about what Europe should be doing, I mean building a European security framework where Ukraine could and should play a bridging role and so on. What we shouldn't be doing is this tug of war that insists the entire Ukrainian nation has to move toward the West. That's exactly the kind of polarization we're being pushed into. And against that background, I think the most important thing right now, well, for Germany, we've just discussed two key points. One thing we've been trying to analyze is how we got drawn into this Atlanticism over the decades, and why it's now even infiltrating the so-called populist parties that originally set out to be different. Even Orban was actually against the war in Russia and so on. But what we're seeing is that, let's say in 2029, if the AfD were to govern in Germany, it's by no means certain that anything would really change. I mean, Alice Weidel is also pro-NATO, pro the 2% defense spending target, and so on. So basically nothing changes.
Da ändert sich gar nichts, ja? Verstehst du, was ich meine, wenn wir sagen Deutschland mal so?
That's actually a phenomenon you often see in political science. When outsider parties turn into establishment parties, they go through this process of homogenization. Exactly. They start moving away from the extremes. And unfortunately right now, let's just be honest, the center, meaning about 2/3 of the entire, I'd say, German or even European space of thought and political imagination, is shaped by the idea of the enemy in the East and the friend in the West. And that's where the AfD faces a choice. Either become part of the system and actually gain power within that normal sphere, or remain outsiders. What's striking, though, is that they've grown as large as they have, precisely because they've held on to that outsider position.
Dadurch, dass sie eben diese Außenseiterposition vertreten hat.
Genau, so jetzt, also ich würde nur mal gerne sagen.
Right, so I just want to say this. Within the AfD, there's a real tug of war going on. The more Trump, let's say, rages around internationally, the clearer it becomes that the AfD, which just a year ago was basically letting itself be pulled along by Trump fans, you know, with Musk and all that, well, back then it felt like that party was being carried by Trump and the Republicans straight toward a German election victory. But the more Trump now, I'd say, tears the whole world apart, and there's really no other way to put it, the more obvious it becomes that this is no longer a solid foundation for their arguments.
Desto mehr ist es natürlich keine sichere Bank mehr für Argumente. Und in dem Moment habe ich das Gefühl, ich habe persönlich das
And at
Gefühl,
that moment, I have the feeling, personally, I really feel, that let's say the East AfD, meaning those who stand for diplomacy, for understanding with Russia, for a peace order, and so on, who are also less libertarian, meaning less, let's say, capitalist, but who still have more of a blue-collar mindset. Yes, that's also a kind of focal point within the AfD, that they're now rising a bit simply because Trump is, well, just so unbelievably bad as he is. But what I wanted to say is we're really talking about two things here. First, about the infiltration of these populist parties, or rather, the system parties. And second, about the transition we're seeing.
Systempartei, den Übergang, den wir sehen, ja. Und wir haben eben darüber gesprochen, dass ich gesagt habe,
And we were just talking about how I said that all of Europe is in a kind of Stockholm syndrome. With this book, we want to offer an opportunity for every country to reflect again on what its relationship with America actually is. Because only then can we, Germany being neutral, Europe being neutral, start a real discussion about how to shift this debate. And now let's take another look back at history. It really wasn't that long ago. We already talked about France and how the French were relatively resilient and resisted Atlanticism for quite a long time.
Lange entgegengestellt haben. Sanchez zum Beispiel ist ja jetzt doch eine dezidiert andere.
Take Sanchez, for example. That's really a distinctly different case now. The only, let's say, reasonable position in Europe at the moment is actually in Spain. Maybe the Irish too, but they can't really assert themselves. By the way, that's also true when it comes to Israel and Ukraine. Quite interesting, actually. But the Italians, for instance, used to be a nation that with Don Camillo and Pepona, so to speak, represented something very Latin in spirit. I wouldn't call it anti-American, but there was definitely a kind of cultural resistance, and so on. The Greeks, by the way, as well.
Die Griechen übrigens auch, ja. Es wurde immer ausgefochten in diesen Ländern. Also natürlich
There's always been conflict in those countries. And of course, when you read the history, you see that those countries were just as influenced and, if you like, just as steered as the Federal Republic. But there was always this kind of cultural resistance. And that cultural resistance started slipping away from us in the late 70s and 80s. This gradual cultural Americanization, Hauke Ritz describes it very well in his book, The End of the West. We managed to hold on against it through the 70s. Back then, we still had people like Jean-Paul Sartre and others. We still had a European sense of confidence, a cultural self-confidence.
Und dann haben wir uns zunehmend verstanden.
And then we started to see ourselves more and more as an interpretation of American culture, and we called that whole thing the West. Most people say, I'm from the West, meaning Europe. So this merging of Europe and the US into the West is, semantically and culturally, really problematic. We are the West? What's that supposed to mean, the West? Is the West now just NATO? And what's left of the West if Trump says, well, NATO's over? You could say, great, if NATO's over, then maybe we in Europe can start thinking about what we actually do without NATO. But if, in Germany, the only thing that comes out of that is some silly debate like, well, if NATO's gone, we'll just go to war with Russia on our own, then that's just absurd.
NATO weg ist, dann gehen wir alleine in den Krieg nach Russland. Also, dümmer geht es ja nicht, ja? Also die Frage
Well,
ist jetzt auch mit
it really couldn't get any dumber.
diese Diskussion
So
über das
the question now, also in connection with this book, is whether we're having this debate about the possible collapse of NATO, which, by the way, is also happening in the United States. There are strong peace movements there that basically want to dismantle NATO, and Trump has, more or less already hinted at that. But you could say that this opens up a range of options. What kind of Europe would we build if NATO no longer existed? Right now, though, it seems like the only European way of thinking about it is, if NATO were gone, we'd have to build a strong European defense. And of course, that European defense would then have to help Ukraine against Russia. And that discussion, naturally, is being driven from Germany.
Und diese Diskussion geht natürlich von Deutschland aus.
Sie muss offensiv
It has to be capable of offensive action. The whole narrative in Europe right now is shifting away from thinking about security as simply keeping the enemy off your own territory. Instead, it's about figuring out how to fight the enemy in all kinds of ways right now. And that's a huge problem. That's where the idea of neutrality could come in, saying yes to defense, no to attack. In other words, not this so-called offensive defense that's being practiced at the moment. It's really quite absurd that even Europe is now taking sides in the war with Iran, saying the blame lies entirely with the Mullah regime. The Mullah regime is to blame for everything that's going wrong right now. When it came to that illegal war of aggression, Mr. Merz even said something like, well, international law doesn't apply to Iran because Iran supposedly violated international law, so it doesn't count anymore. By that logic, you couldn't put a thief on trial anymore because he stole something, so the rule of law wouldn't apply either. That kind of reasoning is just unbelievably twisted. But this stubborn attitude, this idea of saying, no matter what the United States does, we might not be entirely happy about it, but we stand behind it. No, because in the end, we're supposed to be happy about it.
So. Und wenn wir da raus wollen, und deswegen nochmal ist
And if we want to get out of this, so let me say it again, this is, and maybe we could even think about translating the book at some point, but personally, I believe the book is really a basis for discussion. I mean, among the few reasonable Germans sitting here, all of us, the authors of this book, share my sense of disbelief. And actually, we do have majorities in the German population who are against the war. Just to be clear about that, we have majorities in Germany who oppose the war. Right now, we just can't prevail against these deeply deluded German elites who hold all the key positions here. Sorry.
Hier sitzen, ja. Und wir, Entschuldigung?
The problem
we're facing is that a majority of people being against war isn't enough to actually stop one. 70% of the Ukrainian population was against a war with Russia. 70% voted for Zelensky because they wanted a peace candidate, because they wanted reconciliation with Russia. And what did they get? War. Because unfortunately that's not enough. We have to figure out how to achieve, on a smaller and larger scale, in Europe, what Ukraine wasn't able to make happen. How to somehow put a stop to those warmongering 15 to 20% of elites. And I feel we have to do that together with others, in cooperation with Europe, with the Global South, and with Americans who are willing to join in. Somehow, that's the way we need to corner this war-driving class.
Also auch mit den BRICS-Staaten. Ich war gerade in Moskau, da war das Moskau.
Yes, also with the BRICS countries. I was just in Moscow for the Moscow Economic Forum. There, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Brazilians all spoke in a very reasonable way. They said things like, we need a balanced global system, and so on. But maybe to wrap up, just a quick note about the European Peace Project. Yes, we're running this European Peace Project. That's www.europeanpeaceproject.eu. We've posted 2 manifestos there, one about Iran and one about Ukraine and Russia. We actually did something similar last year, and those manifestos are now available online in about 30 languages.
In wirklich 30 Sprachen im Internet. Und die Idee ist einfach, dass wir gemeinsam.
The idea is simple. We want to make a joint appeal, a statement for peace. On May 9th, Europe Day, which used to stand for Never Again War, everyone is invited to read this manifesto out loud at 5 p.m., wherever they are. Anyone can find the text online, choose the version about Iran or Russia, or even combine them, add their own words, create an art piece, or bring a guitar. We're totally open about that. The main point is to mark Europe Day, May 9th at 5 p.m., once again as a day of peace. Not as a day when our governments decide, as Mrs. von der Leyen seems to imagine, that the European Union has to go to war. I'd be really happy if lots of people took part in this. We also made a short film showing how great it was last year. We had pictures from last year, the Colosseum in Rome, the Acropolis in Greece, the Eiffel Tower, and on Red Square, people read it out loud. In Kaliningrad, at the Kant University, people read it too. So everyone, wherever they are, maybe in the town square, can take part. Now, back to your question. How do we get out of this? I think we'll only really get out of it if in every country, and that's why I'm so interested in this video. Maybe we can even turn it into a series if we start a pan-European discussion in every European country. Just the same in Sweden as in Portugal. So how do you deal with America? And only when we've answered that question, so to speak, on a psychoanalytic level, each country for itself, only then can we move forward. Every country, to put it bluntly, has to come to terms with its own act of violation. I remember very clearly when the war in Ukraine began, in Italy there was always that image of Europa on the bull, and in that depiction the bull carried the American flag, while Europa was wrapped in that blue flag with the 12 stars. And yes, let me add right away, I'm not in favor of the EU. The EU is not Europe. But underneath that image, it said, the abduction of Europa.
Aber darunter stand Il Rappo di Europa. Ja, die Europa wird vergewaltigt, und zwar von den Amerikanern.
Europe is being violated by the Americans. That was the image that went viral in Italy at the start of the war in Ukraine. There's already this feeling that everything here, including Germany, Ramstein, the bases, it's all basically one big European violation. I'm saying it deliberately like that. I'm a woman, Europe is a woman, the bull. There's something in that myth worth looking at, and we should take another look and ask ourselves, what are we allowing to be done to us? So Europe as a woman, and that's something to think about in every country. I've mentioned my European Peace Project. We meet once a week on Zoom. There are Hungarians, Poles, Finns, Swedes.
Schweden, wir sind mit 15 Leuten organisieren wir dieses Projekt.
There are 15 of us organizing this project. And during one of our calls, an older Finnish woman spoke up, pretty emotional, almost in tears. And she said that Finland used to have this culture of Finlandization, of keeping an open border with Russia. She said the country did really well with that approach. And she just can't understand how people under 30 or 40 in her country have completely lost any sense of that historical continuity. Now the border's closed, Finland's in NATO, and there's barbed wire standing there. By the way, several towns along the Finnish border have gone bankrupt because, of course, the Russians aren't coming anymore to shop there. So Finland has suffered serious damage as a result.
Finland hat einen extremen Schaden dadurch. Und diese ältere Frau hat in diesem Call nur bedauert,
and this older woman, in that call, just expressed regret that in Finland it's not possible to have a discussion about why the country is acting in such a self-destructive way. Germany is being self-destructive too. I've already explained that. We're becoming the hub of this war anyway. We're the ultimate crazies. And unfortunately, we've already been that twice in our history. Honestly, as a German citizen, you really don't know how to position yourself anymore. Still, I think the only hope is that if we really want to break through this, we need a psychoanalytic process that I believe retells these stories of violation in every country once again.
In jedem Land noch mal nacherzählt, und darüber könnten wir hoffentlich.
And through that, we could hopefully create a kind of cultural and psychological bond and say, if we don't want all that anymore, oh, you too, you feel the same way? So that, in a sense, the stories we're trying to tell in this book, the missed opportunities, what did the Americans actually do with us? Why did we, at so many points, not take a neutral path, but an Atlantic one? And does that still make sense today? And if we could hear those stories from all the different countries, oh, you too, you were deceived as well, then we'd see that this has, in a way, a psychoanalytic dimension.
Es hat hier eine psychoanalytische Dimension. Das ist natürlich ein Prozess, das machen wir nicht heute und nicht morgen.
Of course, this is a process. It's not something we'll do today or tomorrow. We'll probably have to go through this war to gain that experience. I don't know, but at least that would be the point where we could say, if we make it through what's building up right now, at least in Germany, looking at the situation in Ukraine, well, to wrap it up, we're currently building a Ukrainian-German drone factory in Bavaria. The Russians know that. And they also know exactly which parts go into which Ukrainian drone. If even one drone with German components lands on Russian territory, then I don't know what we could possibly say to the Russians to make them hold back after the Wehrmacht killed 27,000.
Dass sie dann noch die Füße stillhalten, nachdem die Wehrmacht 27.000 Sowjetbürger.
Das Problem, was wir haben in Europa, ist,
No,
dass wir
the problem we have in Europe is that we've pushed the moderate voices, like Vladimir Putin's voice, so far into a corner in Russia that now the voices of people like Karaganov and others, who say, then let's strike back, are getting massive support there. Because in the end, not a single Russian attempt at de-escalation with the Europeans has worked. Not one. So Vladimir Putin kept running into a wall the whole time. And now his Russian colleagues are holding it against him that he,
Es wird ihm von seinen russischen Kollegen vorgehalten, dass man
Kennst
das
du gar nicht
so lange.
gut, die Geduld der Russen, die in den letzten Jahren
The
hatten,
patience of the Russians that we've seen over the past few years. Well, I've been here too. We've talked with the Russian ambassador and so on. Their gentleness, their patience, their proposals, the non-aggression pact, Lavrov, the documents. It's all there. It was all offered to us. The hand was always extended. When I go to Moscow as a German, I still meet Russians who say I want to speak German and so on. So that affection for Germany is still there, even after 4 years of war. You really have to wonder how that country manages to sustain itself morally through all of this. But I agree with you, at the Moscow Economic Forum, Dugin was there too.
Auf dem Moskau Economic Forum war dann eben auch Dugin. Das heißt, die Hardliner nehmen jetzt sozusagen ein bisschen.
That means the hardliners are now, so to speak, stepping forward. Why? Because, of course, the pressure is there. I've heard that quite a few times in Moscow. We can't keep sitting on our hands much longer. Why isn't Putin doing anything? Why isn't this moving faster? And so on. And then naturally the hardliners start to take over. And that's why, well, let me just say this again. I want to apologize to everyone who heard that conversation, because maybe today you could hear a bit of my frustration. That deep breath, that feeling that you just can't hold it back anymore, that you can't stop it. That's actually something new for me.
Oder nicht mehr stoppen. Das ist jetzt bei mir tatsächlich neu. Ich habe jetzt lange Jahre gedacht.
For many years, I really believed that with reason, we could have proper debates here in Germany, that we could influence things, organize peace demonstrations, and we did all that, yes. But now, especially with that paper from the Protestant Church and a few other things like that Ukrainian drone factory, I have the feeling it's getting truly serious. We're not stopping anything anymore. And it's like an avalanche. You can't stop it halfway down the mountain. You have to stop it at the very beginning. So I'm grateful for this conversation, Pascal, and I think your channel could become a really important part of building some kind of European network, or maybe it already is.
Oder ist es ja schon?
Wir vernetzen uns schon. Und die gute Nachricht ist, es kommen immer
we're
mehr
already
Leute
connecting
dazu.
with each other.
Der
And the good news is, more and more people are joining in. Like Dirk Pohlmann, who keeps writing amazing pieces.
Wir bauen uns jetzt
Patrick Barth, who's got his own channel now. You, with your channel. We're building this network right now. While in the US, there are people who've been working on these kinds of networks for a long time, and we can plug into what they've built. The question is whether we can still stop the avalanche, or, to put it another way, whether we can somehow steer past the iceberg that's already clearly in sight. But despair isn't a strategy. We have to keep going. That's why I'm grateful for these books. There's nothing else we can do but try to get past that iceberg. Damn it.
Ja, genau. An diesem Eisberg vorbeizukommen, verdammt nochmal.
Wir stellen das jetzt am 19. Mai in Berlin vor.
We're presenting it on May 19th in Berlin. The tickets are already sold out. Let's end on a positive note. So great people all around. I'd be happy if the book reaches a wide audience and can serve as a basis for a discussion about why Germany is neutral. That's the title. My contribution is the last one in the book, and it's called Europe Neutral. Germany alone can't do it.
Europa neutral. Ja, mit Deutschland alleine ist nichts. Ist nichts.
Liebe Zuseherinnen und
Dear viewers, we don't just need a neutral Switzerland or a neutral Germany. We need a neutral Europe, one that stands for peace and understanding among nations. A Europe that, if it defends itself, does so at home, and certainly not offensively. That would be the dream, and that's what we have to work toward. I'm very grateful that great scholars and brilliant minds like you, Ulrike, are working on this. Ulrike Guérot, thank you for your time today.
Ulrike Guérot, danke für deine Zeit heute.
We'll talk again. Thank you, Pascal.